Story 1. The first snowfall of December always felt magical to Emily. The world seemed softer, quieter, blanketed in white. This year, however, the snow carried a sinister weight. Emily had recently moved to a small mountain town, far away from the city noise. She had wanted solitude, a chance to breathe after years of chaos. Her cabin sat at the edge of the forest, isolated but cozy, with a roaring fireplace and a view of the endless trees. It should have been perfect. But from the first night of snowfall, Emily felt watched. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. When she stepped outside to gather firewood, the air didn't just feel cold, it felt alive. The wind didn't just howl, it whispered. Faint murmurs would tickle the edges of her hearing, too soft to understand, but unmistakable. One night, unable to sleep, she stepped onto her porch to clear her mind. The snow stretched out before her, shimmering under the moonlight. She took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill her lungs, and stared at the unbroken blanket of white. That's when she saw them. Footprints. They started at the edge of the forest and led straight to her cabin. Emily froze, her breath hitching. The prints were large, too large for a human, and they stopped right at the base of her porch steps. There were no tracks leading away. Her eyes darted to the tree line, but the woods were silent, shadowed, the darkness impenetrable. She backed into the cabin, locking the door behind her, her heart pounding. She told herself it was an animal, a bear perhaps, though she'd never seen one that close. She tried to shake off the unease, but as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the whispers began again. This time, they were louder. The following morning, Emily decided to investigate. Armed with her phone and a flashlight, she traced the footprints back to the forest's edge. The snow was still fresh, the prints deep and clear. But as she stepped closer, her stomach churned. The prints didn't just stop at the forest. They circled back, looping around her cabin. Her heart raced as she realized the tracks had been there all along, encircling her home, watching her. She ran back inside, slamming the door, and called the local ranger station. The ranger, a gruff man named Harris, arrived an hour later. He inspected the tracks, frowning deeply. "Looks like a wolf," he said, though his tone was uncertain. "A big one." Emily stared at him, waiting for him to say more, but he just adjusted his hat and avoided her gaze. "Do wolves walk in circles?" she asked. Harris didn't answer. That night, Emily locked every window and door. She turned on every light in the cabin, the shadows pressing against the glass like living things. But the whispers grew louder. They seeped through the walls, rising and falling like a ghostly chant. It wasn't the wind, it was voices. Dozens of them, maybe more, speaking a language she couldn't understand. Her fear turned to anger. She grabbed a flashlight and stormed outside, determined to confront whatever was out there. The cold bit into her skin, and the snow crunched underfoot as she circled the cabin. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling. "I'm not afraid of you!" The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, from the edge of the forest, something moved. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form blending with the shadows of the trees. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. Emily stumbled back, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The figure didn't move closer. It didn't need to. Its presence was suffocating, its gaze piercing through her. She turned and ran back inside, slamming the door and bolting it shut. The next day, Harris returned to check on her. Emily told him everything: the whispers, the footprints, the figure in the woods. He listened silently, his face grim. When she finished, he sighed and removed his hat. "Folks around here call it the Whisperer," he said finally. "The Whisperer? A spirit, or something like it. It only comes in winter when the snow falls. It doesn't like people on its land." Emily stared at him, disbelief warring with fear. "You're saying I'm being haunted by a snow spirit?" Harris shrugged. "Call it what you want, but if it's marked you, you need to leave. Now." Emily didn't wait. She packed her things, threw them into her car, and sped down the mountain road, the tires skidding on the icy pavement. But as she drove, the whispers followed. They filled the car, surrounding her, growing louder with each passing mile. The temperature inside the vehicle plummeted, frost creeping across the windows. "Leave," the voices hissed. "Leave." "I'm trying," Emily screamed, her breath visible in the freezing air. The car skidded to a stop as a figure appeared in the road. It was the Whisperer, its towering form blocking her path. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The world went white. Days later, Harris found her car abandoned on the side of the road. The engine was cold, the doors wide open, but there was no sign of Emily. Only her footprints remained, leading back into the forest. Story 2. The winters in North Hollow were brutal, and for James, the isolation made it worse. He had inherited his grandparents' cabin on the edge of town, a place that seemed as forgotten as the forest surrounding it. The locals warned him about spending winter up there. They spoke of strange happenings in the woods, of things that didn't belong to this world. James dismissed their tales as superstition. He was here for peace and quiet, a chance to escape the chaos of city life. But as the first heavy snow fell, blanketing the forest in silence, he began to wonder if there was some truth to their warnings. It started with the footprints. James had stepped outside one morning to chop firewood, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The forest was still, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath his boots. As he approached the woodpile, he noticed a trail of footprints leading from the trees to his cabin. They weren't his. The prints were small, almost childlike, and they stopped abruptly just a few feet from his front door. There were no prints leading away. A chill ran down his spine as he looked around. The forest loomed silently, its skeletal branches draped in snow. He called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Hello, is someone there?" No answer. Shaking off the unease, James returned to his work. He convinced himself it was nothing, just a trick of the snow, perhaps an animal. But as the day wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. That night, the knocking began. It was soft at first, barely audible over the wind. James was sitting by the fire, a book in hand, when he heard it, a gentle tap, tap, tap on the window. He froze, his heart racing. Slowly, he turned his head toward the sound. The window was frosted over, the glass opaque, but he could just make out the outline of a small handprint pressed against the glass. James shot to his feet, his pulse pounding in his ears. He grabbed a flashlight and flung the door open, stepping into the freezing night. The snow was untouched, pristine, as if no one had been there. The forest was silent, save for the faint whisper of the wind. James scanned the tree line, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, but he saw nothing. He went back inside, bolting the door behind him. The knocking continued over the next few nights, always at the same time. Each time James would rush outside, only to find no one there. The handprints on the windows became more frequent, their shapes distorted, as if pressed by something not entirely human. Sleep eluded him, and his nerves began to fray. He took to sitting by the fire with a shotgun in hand, his eyes fixed on the windows. Then, one night, the whispers started. They were faint at first, barely more than a breath against the glass. But as the hours passed, they grew louder, more distinct. "Come out," the voices beckoned. "Come play." James gripped the shotgun tighter, his knuckles white. The voices were high-pitched, almost childlike, but there was something wrong about them. Something hollow, inhuman. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice cracking. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, from the darkness outside, came a low, guttural laugh. The next morning, James decided he couldn't stay another night. He packed his things, ready to leave the cabin behind for good. As he loaded his truck, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The footprints were back, circling the cabin in a perfect loop. They weren't just near the windows this time. They were everywhere. And they weren't alone. Interspersed with the childlike prints were larger ones, impossibly large, as if some giant beast had been pacing outside his home. James threw the last of his bags into the truck and climbed into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and he sped down the snow-covered road, his tires skidding on the icy surface. But as he reached the edge of the forest, the truck came to a sudden halt. The engine died, the headlights flickering out, plunging him into darkness. James cursed, fumbling with the keys, but the truck wouldn't start. The cold seeped into the cab, and the air grew heavy, oppressive. Then he heard it, the knocking. This time it wasn't on the windows, it was on the roof. James sat frozen, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. He could hear the snow creaking under the weight of whatever was up there, its movements slow and deliberate. Suddenly the windshield cracked, a long, jagged line spiderwebbing across the glass. James screamed, throwing the door open and stumbling out into the snow. The forest was alive with movement now, shadows darting between the trees, their shapes indistinct and shifting. The whispers surrounded him, a cacophony of voices, each one pulling at his sanity. "Come play, James!" He ran, his boots slipping on the icy ground. The shadows followed, their laughter echoing through the trees. No matter how far he ran, the cabin seemed to loom ahead of him, as if the forest itself were conspiring to trap him. Finally, he collapsed in the snow, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The shadows closed in, their forms becoming more solid. He could see them now, children with hollow eyes and twisted smiles, their hands outstretched. Behind them loomed a massive figure, its body cloaked in darkness, its eyes burning like embers. "Stay with us," the voices whispered. Days later, the locals found James's truck abandoned at the edge of the forest. The cabin was empty, its interior eerily untouched. But in the snow outside, they found footprints, dozens of them, circling the cabin and leading into the woods. No one ever saw James again. Story 3. The village of Frosthaven was a place trapped in eternal winter. Perched on the edge of a sprawling glacier, it was isolated, its small population bound together by necessity rather than choice. The villagers were used to the biting cold and howling winds, but there was one sound they dreaded above all others: the singing. It always came at night, carried on the icy winds like a mournful wail. No one knew where it came from, but everyone in Frosthaven agreed on one thing: the singing meant death. Iris had lived in Frosthaven her entire life. At 24, she had heard the tales more times than she could count. Stories of villagers disappearing after hearing the eerie song, of bodies found frozen solid with expressions of pure terror etched into their faces. Her grandmother, the village elder, had always warned her, "If you hear the singing, lock your doors, cover your ears, and pray it passes you by." Iris used to dismiss it as superstition, a way for the elders to keep the younger generation in line. But when her childhood friend Lila vanished during one of those nights, she started to believe. Lila had heard it first. Iris still remembered the terror in her voice when she described the melody, a haunting, ethereal tune that seemed to call her name. The next morning, Lila was gone. The villagers searched for days, but all they found were footprints in the snow leading to the glacier's edge. They stopped looking after that. No one ever ventured near the glacier. The night it happened, Iris was alone in her small cottage at the edge of the village. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. She was mending a torn scarf, her mind wandering, when she heard it. The singing. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind. A single voice, soft and melodic, weaving a tune so sorrowful it made her chest ache. Iris froze, her needle slipping from her fingers. The stories flooded back, each one more horrifying than the last. Her grandmother's warning echoed in her mind. "Lock your doors, cover your ears." But she didn't move. The song grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a melody, it was a voice, and it was calling her name. Iris. Her breath hitched. She stumbled to her feet, her heart pounding like a drum. The rational part of her mind screamed to lock the door, to block out the sound, but the voice, it was so beautiful. Before she realized what she was doing, she was at the door, her hand on the latch. The cold seeped through the wood, chilling her to the bone. Iris. It was closer now, almost at her doorstep. She hesitated, her hand trembling. The voice sounded familiar, achingly so. It sounded like Lila. The door creaked open, and the icy wind rushed in, biting at her skin. The village lay silent under the moonlight, the snow glistening like diamonds. And then she saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the village, cloaked in shadow. Its form was indistinct, shifting as if it were made of smoke and ice. But the voice, it was undeniably Lila's. "Iris, come with me." Iris stepped outside, the snow crunching under her boots. The cold was unbearable, but she couldn't stop. The figure turned and began to walk, its movements graceful and fluid. "Iris, wait!" The voice was not her own. She turned to see her grandmother standing in the doorway, her face pale with fear. "Don't follow it, please." Iris hesitated, torn between the familiar warmth of her grandmother's plea and the siren call of the figure. The singing grew louder, drowning out her grandmother's voice. It was a choir now, dozens of voices weaving together in a haunting harmony. They came from the glacier, echoing across the frozen landscape. "Iris." The figure reached the edge of the glacier and stopped, turning to face her. Its face was obscured, but its eyes were Lila's. The villagers found her the next morning, lying at the glacier's edge. She was alive but unconscious, her skin as cold as the ice beneath her. When she woke, she refused to speak of what she had seen. But she wasn't the same. Her once warm and lively eyes were now distant, haunted. The singing stopped after that night, but the villagers knew it was only a matter of time before it returned. And when it did, Iris would be the first to hear it. Story 4. The winters in Grey Hollow were unforgiving, but the forest surrounding the small village was worse. Known as the Silent Woods, the thick trees seemed to swallow sound, leaving the air unnaturally quiet. No one dared enter, especially in winter, when the snow blanketed the ground and muffled even the faintest crunch of footsteps. The stories about the Silent Woods were as old as the village itself. They spoke of figures that moved between the trees, shadows that didn't belong, and whispers that would lead the unwary into the heart of the forest, never to return. Emily had lived in Grey Hollow for only a year. A city girl at heart, she moved to the village after inheriting her late aunt's small cottage on the outskirts of town. The villagers were kind but distant, their lives shaped by the harsh winters and the ever-present fear of the woods. They warned her, of course. "Don't go near the woods after dark," they said. "And if you hear whispers, cover your ears and run." Emily laughed it off. To her, the Silent Woods were just a patch of forest, beautiful and serene. The stories were nothing more than old wives' tales meant to scare children. But her perspective changed one snowy evening. It began with a knock at the door. Emily was curled up by the fire, a cup of tea warming her hands, when the sharp rap startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the village was too remote for visitors to just drop by unannounced. Frowning, she set her cup down and went to the door. Through the frosted glass, she could make out a figure standing in the snow. It was a child. Emily opened the door, the cold air rushing in and stealing her breath. The child, a girl no older than 10, stood barefoot in the snow, her thin dress fluttering in the wind. Her skin was pale, her lips blue, and her dark eyes seemed far too large for her face. "Are you lost?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. "Where are your parents?" The girl didn't answer. She simply tilted her head, her gaze fixed on Emily. "Come inside," Emily said, stepping aside. "You'll freeze out there." The girl didn't move. Instead, she raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the woods. "Come," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're waiting." Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. She looked past the girl, toward the edge of the forest. The trees stood tall and still, their branches heavy with snow. "Who's waiting?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The girl didn't answer. She turned and began walking toward the woods, her bare feet leaving no prints in the snow. "Wait!" Emily called, stepping outside. The girl stopped at the tree line and looked back, her dark eyes gleaming. "Come," she said again, her voice echoing unnaturally. Against her better judgment, Emily followed. The silence was immediate and absolute. As soon as she stepped into the forest, the world seemed to change. The wind stopped, the distant howl of wolves faded, and even her own footsteps made no sound. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice swallowed by the silence. The girl didn't respond. She moved deeper into the woods, her movements unnaturally fluid, almost like she was gliding. Emily's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. She tried to stop, to turn back, but her legs carried her forward as if she were being pulled by an unseen force. The deeper they went, the darker it became. The snow no longer glistened, and the shadows between the trees seemed to shift and writhe. And then she heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, like a breeze brushing against her ear, but it grew louder, more insistent. "Emily!" Her name, spoken in a voice she didn't recognize. "Emily, come closer." She stopped, her heart pounding. The girl was gone, vanished into the shadows. "Emily!" The whisper was everywhere and nowhere, circling her like a predator. She turned in every direction, but all she saw were trees and snow. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. A figure stepped out from the shadows. It was her aunt. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her aunt looked exactly as she remembered, tall and wiry, her gray hair pulled into a bun. But there was something wrong. Her eyes were black, the whites completely gone, and her smile was too wide, stretching unnaturally across her face. "You've come back," her aunt said, her voice distorted, as if layered with a dozen others. Emily stumbled backward, shaking her head. "You're not her. You're not real." The thing wearing her aunt's face laughed, a sound that sent ice through Emily's veins. "They're waiting for you, Emily," it said, its smile widening. "We've always been waiting." She turned and ran, her legs burning as she pushed through the snow. The whispers followed, growing louder, more frantic. "Don't leave! Come back! You belong to us!" The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches clawing at her coat. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, as if she were running on ice about to crack. When she finally burst out of the forest, she collapsed into the snow, gasping for air. The whispers stopped, and the silence was replaced by the distant howl of the wind. She looked back at the woods. The trees stood still and silent, as if nothing had happened. But she knew better. Emily left Grey Hollow the next day, leaving the cottage and everything in it behind. The villagers didn't question her decision. They had seen the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had claimed so many before her. The silent woods remained as they always had, their secrets buried beneath the snow. But on cold winter nights, when the wind died down and the village grew quiet, the whispers could still be heard. And those who listened too closely were never seen again. Story 5. Nestled deep in the heart of the Arctic wilderness was a cabin long abandoned, its once warm hearth now cold and forgotten. Locals referred to it as the Frostbitten Cabin. Its reputation was a dark one. Every explorer, every adventurer, every soul who had ever spent a night within its walls had disappeared, leaving nothing behind but strange tracks in the snow leading deeper into the frozen expanse. For Sarah and her friends, the stories of the Frostbitten Cabin were just tales, old legends spun to keep curious travelers away from the harsh tundra. They had come to the Arctic seeking adventure, a break from the monotony of city life. Sarah, the group leader, was the kind who sought thrill and mystery. The cabin was their destination, its eerie history only adding to the allure. "It's just an old cabin," Sarah had said as they planned their trip. "We'll spend one night there, prove the stories are nonsense, and come back with a great story to tell." Her friends, Max, Elena, and Dylan, had reluctantly agreed. But as they trekked through the endless white expanse, the chill seeping into their bones, they began to question their decision. The cabin appeared just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of gray and blue. It sat alone on a small rise, its silhouette stark against the icy landscape. "It looks normal," Max said, his voice muffled by the scarf around his face. But Elena shook her head. "Normal? It looks like it's waiting for us." Sarah ignored her, pushing forward. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they approached. The cabin's windows were dark, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Inside, it was colder than they expected. The walls were covered in frost, and the air was heavy with a strange metallic scent. "It's just a cabin," Sarah said again, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Dylan set down his pack and began unpacking their supplies. "Let's get a fire going. This place is freezing." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering light across the room. They huddled close, eating canned food and sharing nervous laughter. "It's just one night," Sarah reminded them. "Tomorrow, we'll head back." But as the hours passed, the unease in the cabin grew. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners, and the wind outside howled like a living thing. It was Dylan who first noticed the footprints. "Hey guys, come look at this." They gathered near the door, where the snow had blown in. The prints were small, like those of a child, but they were wrong. The toes were too long, too thin, almost claw-like. "They weren't there when we came in," Max said, his voice trembling. "Someone's playing a prank," Sarah said, though she didn't sound convinced. The night deepened, and the temperature dropped even further. Despite the fire, the cold seemed to seep into their bones. Elena was the first to hear the scratching. It started softly, like a branch brushing against the window, but grew louder, more insistent. "There's something outside," she whispered, clutching her blanket. Sarah grabbed a flashlight and peered out the frosted window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but swirling snow. "It's just the wind," she said, though her hands shook as she set the flashlight down. But the scratching continued, moving from the window to the walls, then to the door. "Someone's out there," Max said, his eyes wide. No, Elena whispered. Something's out there. The fire dimmed, its light flickering weakly. Sarah fed it more wood, but the flames seemed reluctant to grow. And then they heard the voice, a child's voice, soft and melodic, drifting through the cold. "Help me! Please!" It came from outside, barely audible over the wind. "We can't just leave them out there," Dylan said, moving toward the door. "No," Sarah grabbed his arm. "You don't know what's out there." "But what if it's real?" Dylan pulled free and opened the door. The wind rushed in, extinguishing the fire and plunging the room into darkness. "Wait!" Sarah called, but Dylan had already stepped outside. They huddled in the dark, waiting for Dylan to return. Minutes stretched into an eternity, and then they heard his scream. It was high-pitched, filled with terror, and it ended abruptly. Elena sobbed, her breath visible in the freezing air. "We have to leave. We have to leave now." Max nodded, grabbing his pack, but Sarah hesitated. "We can't just leave him out there." "He's gone!" Elena shouted, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you get it? Whatever's out there took him." They ran. The snowstorm had worsened, the wind howling like a banshee, but they pushed forward, leaving the cabin behind. The footprints followed them, those small, claw-like prints that seemed to multiply the further they went. Max stumbled and fell, his scream cutting through the night as something dragged him into the snow. "Max!" Sarah reached for him, but Elena pulled her back. "Run!" By the time they reached the edge of the forest, only Sarah and Elena remained. They collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. The storm had passed, and the world was eerily quiet, but the footprints were still there, circling them. "Do you hear that?" Elena whispered, her eyes wide with terror. Sarah listened. In the distance, carried on the wind, was the sound of a child's laughter. They never made it back to the village. The search party found the cabin empty, its door swinging open in the wind. In the snow outside were hundreds of small, claw-like prints, leading into the wilderness. And on cold, silent nights, travelers swear they can hear a child's voice, calling from the frost-bitten cabin. Days turned into weeks, and the rumors of the frost-bitten cabin only grew stronger. The search party, after finding no trace of Sarah, Eleanor, or their friends, whispered of strange occurrences, footprints appearing overnight, whispers in the wind, and a haunting laughter that echoed through the frozen wilderness. The cabin remained untouched, its dark windows staring blankly at the tundra like hollow eyes. But curiosity never stayed dormant for long. Months later, a new group of adventurers arrived in the Arctic, their sights set on unraveling the mysteries of the frost-bitten cabin. Among them was Matthew, a writer seeking inspiration, and Clara, a skeptic who scoffed at ghost stories. With them were two seasoned guides, Ivan and Greta, locals familiar with the area, but wary of the cabin's reputation. "People vanish because they are unprepared for the Arctic," Greta said as they approached the cabin. "Not because of ghosts," but Ivan shook his head. "It's not just the cold. This place, it's wrong. You'll see." The cabin looked just as it had in the stories, isolated, weathered, and unwelcoming. As they stepped inside, a wave of icy air greeted them, far colder than the tundra outside. The metallic scent hung heavy in the air, and the walls seemed to shimmer with frost, despite the absence of wind. "This is it?" Clara asked, setting her pack down. "Looks like any other abandoned shack." Matthew didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the faint footprints that led from the door to the center of the room, where they abruptly ended. Greta shivered. "We shouldn't stay here long." As night fell, the group huddled around a portable heater, their flashlights casting long shadows across the walls. Clara laughed as Greta recounted the legends of the frost-bitten cabin. "They say the cabin calls to people," Greta said, her voice low. that it lures them in with whispers and traps them here. And those footprints? They don't belong to a child. They belong to something older, something ancient. Clara rolled her eyes. Let me guess. The footprints lead to an underground lair where monsters wait to feast on foolish tourists. But Matthew wasn't laughing. He'd been silent all evening, his eyes darting to the windows every few minutes. I heard something, he said suddenly. The group fell silent. What did you hear? Ivan asked, his voice tense. A laugh, Matthew whispered. A child's laugh. The laughter grew louder as the night deepened, a high-pitched giggle that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Ivan tried to convince the group to leave, but the snowstorm outside had worsened, trapping them inside the cabin. Matthew, unable to sit still, began pacing. It's testing us, he muttered. It knows we're here, and it's playing with us. Who's playing with us? Clara demanded, her bravado faltering. The thing that leaves the footprints, Matthew said, his voice hollow. The scratching began just after midnight. It started at the windows, moved to the walls, and then to the door. Ivan grabbed a knife from his pack, while Greta clutched a flashlight. Whatever's out there, it's not getting in, Ivan said, his knuckles white around the blade. But as the scratching grew louder, more frantic, the door began to creak. Don't open it, Greta warned as Matthew moved toward the door. But Matthew was transfixed. The scratching stopped, replaced by a soft, melodic voice. Help me, please. Matthew reached for the handle. Stop, Ivan shouted, pulling him back, but it was too late. The door flew open, and the storm rushed in, extinguishing the heater and plunging the cabin into darkness. Chaos erupted. Clara screamed as the wind howled through the room, carrying with it a strange, unearthly laughter. Greta's flashlight flickered, revealing glimpses of the thing outside. It wasn't a child. It stood hunched and twisted, its elongated limbs ending in clawed hands that scraped against the floor. Its face was pale and featureless, save for a wide, toothless mouth that stretched impossibly far. The creature lunged. In the confusion, Ivan pushed Clara toward the back of the cabin. Run! He shouted, slashing at the creature with his knife. Matthew stood frozen, staring at the thing as it crawled toward him. It's not real, he whispered. It can't be real. The creature reached him, its claws wrapping around his leg. He screamed as it dragged him toward the door, his cries swallowed by the storm. Clara and Greta managed to escape through a side window, the storm blinding them as they stumbled into the snow. Behind them, the cabin glowed faintly, as if lit from within by an unnatural light. They didn't stop running until they reached the tree line. What about Ivan? Clara gasped, her chest heaving. Greta shook her head, tears streaming down her face. He's gone. Weeks later, Clara returned to the Arctic, determined to uncover the truth about the frost-bitten cabin. But when she arrived at its location, there was nothing there. No cabin, no footprints, just an endless expanse of snow. And on the wind, faint but unmistakable, was the sound of a child's laughter. Clara stood motionless at the edge of the Arctic expanse, staring into the endless stretch of snow. The absence of the cabin made her heart race. It had been there, she had seen it, had run from it. Yet now, all that remained was an unsettling emptiness. The child's laughter whispered through the cold wind again, teasing and faint. It sent a chill down Clara's spine, not because of the sound itself, but because of the eerie familiarity in its tone. The laugh seemed to mock her. Her breath formed plumes in the freezing air as she scanned the landscape, desperate to find a clue, anything that could ground her. But her mind was playing tricks on her, warping the distant snowbanks into shapes that almost looked like hunched figures. She shook her head and turned to the guide who had brought her back to this cursed spot. His name was Eric, a rugged man who had dismissed the tales of the frostbitten cabin as mere folklore. But even Eric now looked unsettled. Are you sure this is the spot? Clara asked, her voice trembling. I don't understand, Eric muttered, his voice unusually soft. I've guided expeditions through this region for years. The terrain doesn't just change. It was here, Clara insisted, panic creeping into her tone. The cabin was right here. I saw it. I ran from it. Eric's gaze hardened. You're sure? Yes, Clara snapped, and I'm not leaving until we find it. Hours passed as they searched the surrounding area. Clara's desperation grew with every passing minute. She retraced her steps, even pulled out a map and GPS to confirm her location. The cabin had existed. She wasn't crazy, but as the sky began to dim and the pale sun sank lower, Eric insisted they leave. It's dangerous to stay out here after dark, he warned. This storm is picking up, and the temperatures will drop fast. Clara hesitated, her resolve weakening. As much as she hated to admit it, she was terrified of being caught out in the open. The storm carried a sharp, biting wind, and the darkness felt far too oppressive. Reluctantly, she agreed to return to their camp. That night, as Clara sat by the fire, she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Eric had retired to his tent, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The Arctic wind howled outside, but beneath it was another sound, a faint scratching. Clara froze, her hand gripping her blanket. She held her breath, straining to hear. Scratch, scratch. It was faint but deliberate, coming from somewhere just beyond the light of the fire. Her pulse quickened as she scanned the shadows. Eric, she called softly, her voice trembling. No response. She reached for a flashlight, her fingers shaking as she clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the snow just beyond the camp. At first, there was nothing, just an empty expanse of white. Then she saw them. Footprints. They were small, impossibly small, like those of a child, and they were fresh. Clara's stomach churned. The memories of that night at the cabin came rushing back. The laughter, the scratching, the creature. She scrambled to her feet and stumbled toward Eric's tent, throwing open the flap. "Eric, wake up!" she hissed. Eric stirred groggily. "What is it?" "There's something out there," Clara whispered. Eric sat up, his expression hardening as he grabbed his flashlight and rifle. He stepped outside with Clara close behind, the two of them scanning the area. The footprints were gone. "I swear they were right there," Clara said, her voice shaking. Eric frowned. "You're tired. Maybe the snow played tricks on you." "No," Clara insisted, her voice rising. "I saw them." Eric's gaze softened, but before he could respond, a sound cut through the wind, a low, guttural growl. The growl sent a jolt of terror through Clara. Eric spun toward the sound, his flashlight shaking in his grip. The beam of light fell on something in the distance, a dark, hunched figure. "What the hell is that?" Eric muttered, raising his rifle. The figure didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. It was taller than any human, its elongated limbs casting grotesque shadows on the snow. Clara's heart pounded as she recognized the silhouette. "It's the thing from the cabin," she whispered. Eric glanced at her, confusion flashing in his eyes. "Stay behind me." He took a cautious step forward, the rifle trained on the figure. But as the flashlight's beam moved closer, the figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows like mist. "What the?" Eric began, but his words were cut off as the ground beneath them trembled. The snow erupted in front of them, and the creature emerged, its twisted form more horrifying than Clara remembered. Its pale, featureless face turned toward them, and its mouth stretched into an impossible grin. Eric fired, the shot echoing through the night. The bullet struck the creature, but it didn't even flinch. Instead, it lunged toward Eric, its clawed hand swiping through the air. "Run!" Eric shouted, shoving Clara backward. Clara stumbled, her instincts taking over as she turned and fled. Behind her, Eric's screams pierced the night, followed by an eerie silence. Clara didn't stop running until she collapsed, her lungs burning and her legs trembling. She looked back, but there was no sign of the creature, or Eric. She was alone. The wind carried a familiar sound to her ears, a high-pitched giggle. It sent shivers down her spine as she realized the laughter was closer now, circling her like a predator. "Why are you doing this?" she screamed into the darkness. The laughter stopped. A voice, soft and melodic, answered, "You called to us." The realization hit Clara like a thunderbolt. Her return to the Arctic, her obsession with the cabin, it had drawn the entity to her. As the wind howled and the shadows closed in, Clara understood the truth. She had become part of the frostbitten cabin's story. And this time, there would be no escape. Clara sank to her knees, trembling, her breath visible in the frigid air. The voice had felt like it came from everywhere and nowhere, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. The silence that followed was worse than the voice itself. The Arctic wind no longer howled. It whispered now, as if the very air around her carried the entity's presence. Her mind raced. She couldn't stop hearing its words. "You called to us." "No," she muttered, clutching her head, trying to block out the ringing echoes of the voice. I didn't call anyone." But deep down, she knew that wasn't entirely true. The cabin had lingered in her mind for years, haunting her thoughts, fueling her obsession to return. Every step she'd taken to come back here had brought her closer to this nightmare. The laughter returned, closer, sharper, more childlike. Clara spun around, searching for the source, her heart pounding in her chest. Her flashlight flickered as she aimed it wildly in every direction, but the shadows seemed to dance just out of reach. "Who are you?" she screamed, her voice breaking. No response came, only the soft crunch of footsteps in the snow behind her. Clara whipped around, but there was nothing there. The snow was untouched, pristine. The footsteps continued, this time to her left. She turned again, only to find more emptiness. Her breathing quickened. "Please, just leave me alone." A small figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light of her flickering flashlight. Clara froze as she saw it. A child, no older than 7 or 8, wearing a tattered coat far too thin for the Arctic cold. The child's face was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes, they were black. Entirely black, devoid of emotion or humanity. "Help me," the child said, their voice trembling. Clara's heart ached for a moment, a maternal instinct tugging at her even through her fear. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. The child's lips didn't move in sync with the words. It was as though the voice came from somewhere else, using the child as a puppet. I can't," Clara stammered, stepping back. The child tilted their head, the motion unnaturally sharp, and smiled. It wasn't a child's smile. It was wide, grotesque, stretching far beyond what should have been possible. "You can't leave," the child whispered. The ground beneath Clara's feet shifted suddenly, and she stumbled. The snow seemed to ripple, as if it were alive. Her flashlight fell from her hands, landing in the snow and casting long, erratic shadows. Clara scrambled to retrieve it, but her hands were numb and shaking. When she looked up, the child was gone. The laughter started again, louder this time, coming from all directions. Clara clutched her ears, trying to drown it out, but it only grew louder, piercing her skull like nails. "Stop it!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Please stop." The laughter ceased abruptly, replaced by the guttural growl she had heard earlier. Clara turned toward the sound and her heart nearly stopped. The creature was there, towering over her. Its elongated limbs cast jagged shadows across the snow, and its featureless face seemed to pulse, as if it were trying to take shape. "Why me?" Clara whispered, barely able to form the words. The creature didn't answer. It lunged toward her, its clawed hand swiping through the air. Clara screamed and dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its grasp. She scrambled to her feet and ran, her boots sinking into the snow with every step. The storm had picked up again, the wind howling and blinding her with flurries of snow. Clara didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she didn't stop. The growling was behind her, closer now. She didn't dare look back, afraid that seeing the creature would paralyze her with fear. Ahead, through the swirling snow, Clara saw a faint light. It was distant, flickering like a beacon. Hope surged through her chest. Maybe it was another camp, or a rescue team searching for her. She pushed herself harder, her feet slipping and stumbling in the snow. The light grew brighter, closer, until she could make out its source. Her heart sank. It was the cabin. The frostbitten cabin stood in the exact spot where it had vanished earlier, its windows glowing with an eerie golden light. Clara stopped in her tracks, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature's growls were right behind her now, but she couldn't bring herself to move. The cabin seemed to call to her, pulling her forward against her will. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not going back in there." The growling grew louder, and Clara realized she had no choice. If she stayed outside, the creature would tear her apart. The cabin might be a trap, but it was her only chance. With trembling legs, she forced herself to move, each step feeling heavier than the last. She reached the door and hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the handle. The growling was deafening now, accompanied by the sound of crunching snow as the creature closed in. Clara took a deep breath and yanked the door open, throwing herself inside. The warmth of the cabin enveloped her immediately, a stark contrast to the icy cold outside. The door slammed shut behind her, and the growling ceased. Clara collapsed to the floor, her body trembling. She was safe, for now. But as she looked around, she realized the cabin was different. The walls seemed to pulse, the wooden beams creaking as though they were alive. The furniture was covered in a thick layer of frost, and the air was heavy with the scent of decay. Clara's gaze fell on the fireplace, where a single figure sat in the chair she remembered all too well. The old man. His empty eye sockets turned toward her, and a twisted smile spread across his face. "Welcome back," he rasped, his voice like ice scraping against metal. Story 6. Winter had always been Jenna's favorite season. The crisp air, the silence of the snow, and the way the world felt softer somehow. But this winter was different. There was an oppressive stillness in the air, a heaviness that made her chest tighten whenever she stepped outside. The small town she lived in, nestled deep in the mountains, had been covered in snow for weeks, and while it should have been picturesque, it felt suffocating instead. The isolation was part of the charm, Jenna told herself, as she made her way back from the local store, her boots crunching in the snow. She had moved here to escape the chaos of the city, trading traffic noise for the quiet of pine trees and mountain views. Her cabin was a good mile from the nearest neighbor, but she didn't mind. She liked the solitude. Or she used to. The first strange thing happened 2 nights ago. She'd been lying in bed, the wind howling outside, when she heard it. A faint muffled crying. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the creaking of the trees. It was distinct, human, and undeniably close. She had convinced herself it was her imagination. The wind played tricks on people, especially in the dead of night. But the next morning, when she stepped outside to fetch firewood, she found something that made her blood run cold. There, in the snow beneath her bedroom window, were footprints. Small ones, bare feet, and they led away from the cabin, disappearing into the forest. Jenna couldn't stop staring at them, her breath visible in the freezing air. The prints were impossibly close to the house. She'd heard no one, seen no one. Who would be wandering barefoot in the snow, in temperatures cold enough to freeze flesh in minutes? Her mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe one of the locals was messing with her, though they'd been nothing but kind since she'd moved in. Or maybe it was a lost child, though that thought felt even more unsettling. Get a grip, she muttered to herself, forcing her legs to move. She needed to get back inside. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though Jenna couldn't shake the unease that crept under her skin. She double-checked the locks on her doors and windows that night, something she'd never bothered to do before. As she lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, she told herself there was nothing to worry about. She was safe. But when the crying started again, closer this time, her heart nearly stopped. It was unmistakable now, a soft, pitiful wailing that came from just outside. Jenna sat up, her body rigid, her ears straining to catch every sound. The crying rose and fell, carrying an eerie rhythm that made her stomach churn. She debated what to do. Calling the police seemed ridiculous. They'd laugh at her for being scared of the wind. But ignoring it felt impossible. What if it really was a child? What if someone needed help? Finally, she threw on her coat, grabbed a flashlight, and opened the front door. The icy wind bit at her skin as she stepped out onto the porch, her breath forming clouds in the air. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaking. The crying stopped abruptly. Jenna's flashlight swept across the snow-covered yard, illuminating the trees that stood like sentinels around her cabin. Nothing moved. The world was silent, save for the sound of her own breathing. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. Movement near the edge of the forest. "Who's there?" she demanded, the beam of her flashlight trembling as she aimed it toward the trees. At first, she saw nothing. But then, slowly, a figure emerged. It was small, hunched, and as it stepped into the light, Jenna's heart clenched. It was a child, a little girl, no older than 6, wearing a thin white dress that was completely inappropriate for the freezing weather. Her hair hung in dark, matted strands, and her face was pale, almost blue. But it was her eyes that froze Jenna in place. They were empty, hollow sockets that stared back at her as if they could still see. "Help me," the girl whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. Jenna couldn't speak. She couldn't move. The girl stepped closer, her bare feet leaving no prints in the snow. Panic surged through Jenna, breaking the paralysis that held her. She stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her flashlight clattering to the floor. The crying started again, louder this time, and it was coming from right outside the door. Jenna clamped her hands over her ears, but the sound seemed to seep into her skull, relentless and piercing. "Go away!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Leave me alone!" The crying stopped. Silence pressed down on her like a weight, heavy and suffocating. Jenna waited, her breath hitching, her body trembling. Minutes passed. Then from behind her she heard the faint creak of a floorboard. She spun around, but there was nothing there. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the dying embers of the fireplace. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. A shadow shifted in the corner of the room. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Jenna saw it. She grabbed a poker from the fireplace, holding it in front of her like a weapon. "Who's there?" The shadow moved again, slithering along the wall like liquid darkness. It stretched and morphed, taking shape until it resembled the little girl. But this time, there was something more grotesque about her. Her limbs were too long, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, and her mouth. It stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "You let us in!" the creature hissed, its voice overlapping with the cries of many others. Jenna backed away, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. "No, I didn't," she stammered, her grip tightening on the poker. The creature advanced, its hollow eyes boring into her. "You heard us! You called us! And now we are here!" Jenna's scream echoed through the cabin as the shadows closed in, swallowing the light, the warmth, and her desperate cries for help. The next morning, the cabin stood silent, surrounded by pristine snow. The locals would later say they never saw Jenna again. But sometimes on cold, windy nights, they could hear faint cries coming from the woods, a soft, pitiful wailing that sent shivers down their spines. No one dared investigate, and no one ever returned to that cabin. After Jenna's disappearance, the small town felt the weight of unease. Whispers surrounded the cabin at the edge of the woods, where the wind howled endlessly, and shadows seemed to shift unnaturally. Though most dismissed it as superstition, those who ventured too close at night spoke of soft, distant cries echoing through the trees. It was unsettling, but no one dared speak of it too loudly. Sarah, a newcomer, had heard the stories but brushed them aside as mere ghost tales. But one late afternoon, she found herself standing before the cabin, curiosity pulling her in. As she approached, a chill crawled up her spine. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar, inviting her in. Despite the creeping dread, Sarah pressed on, her footsteps muffled in the thick snow. Inside, the cabin was eerily still, untouched by time. The air was thick, cold, and the fireplace had long since died. Then she heard it, a soft crying, like a child weeping from another room. It grew louder as she approached. Her heart pounded, her flashlight trembling in her hands. She called out softly, but the crying stopped. For a moment, everything was still. But then, a figure appeared in the dim light. The same little girl who had vanished with Jenna. Her face was pale and obscured by tangled hair, eyes hollow with sadness and malice. "Help me," the girl whispered. Her voice seemed broken, distant. Fear gripped Sarah as the temperature dropped, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Who are you?" she whispered, barely able to speak. Without warning, the girl's mouth opened wide, revealing jagged teeth. "You should have left," she hissed. "You called us." The room shifted, shadows moving like living creatures, the air thickening. Sarah realized she had walked into something ancient and dark. The shadows grew, wrapping around her, the child's form morphing into something monstrous. "You belong to us now," it rasped, its voice a chorus of whispers. Sarah stumbled backward, the darkness closing in. The voices, twisted and pleading, surrounded her. She ran, desperately trying to reach the door. It wouldn't open. The shadows slithered around her, pressing in, choking her breath. Just as the cold fingers of the creature touched her, the door burst open, and she was thrown into the snow outside. The daylight was blinding, but the creature's cries followed her, distant yet close. She ran, heart pounding, knowing the shadows would never let her go. Later, they found her in the snow, eyes wide open, mouth stretched in a scream frozen in time. There was no sign of the girl, no trace of the shadows, only the faint sound of crying in the wind.